Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today in 1967, the Doors single Light My Fire was released, and there was no looking back. Although it's the anniversary of the single, I want to talk about the Doors' first album, their self-titled debut, because this album is one of the best debut albums from any artist ever, particularly in the rock genre. I'd put it up there with the first Led Zeppelin album, with the first Van Halen album. It really had it all. It introduced a new band to the world, none of whose members were known before. It was a completely new sound. There were new ideas. It was a new vibe, and there was no filler. Every song on the album was really, really good. And it made a huge statement. Now, the Doors are one of the best bands of all time because they had all of the right elements. You had super talented, innovative, musicians who were not afraid of pushing boundaries, not afraid of exploring different sonic textures, not afraid of improvising together, not afraid to back up a singer who was unpredictable. Ray Manzarek, wonderful keyboard player. Robbie Krieger, such an underrated guitar player. John Densmore, such a cool, laid back, rock steady, but invigorating and interesting drummer. And of course, they all backed up Jim Morrison. Now, some people say that Jim Morrison didn't have a great voice. Well, I don't know where these people are coming from. I think he had a really great voice because it had a lot of dynamic range. It could be very pleasant. It could be virtually a crooning style voice. Then it could be an emphatic, exciting, chaotic voice. And then it could scream in the, rock and roll traditions that Morrison was frankly helping to invent at the time. I think one of the reasons that people are either divided into people that are obsessed with the Doors or people that underrate them is because of the mystique that grew up around them. And a lot of it was no fault of the band themselves because some of it was related to the death, or shall I say, alleged death of Jim Morrison, and all of the lore that came after that. I just engaged in something. Now, is he really alive? Is he not? I mean, I think the band members, his fellow band members, all tend to agree that he did die in the early 70s when they say he did. But there was that. There was the Oliver Stone movie that exaggerated or just frankly made up a lot about the band and made it seem like they were more interested in show than substance, where this was never really true. They were always a band that was very much into substance. Well, that's a bit of a double entendre, but what I meant by that is musical substance. Ray, Robbie, and John were really good musicians. Jim, as I said, was a good vocalist, and his poetry was really interesting. You can like it, you can dislike it, but he took it very seriously, and he had some interesting things to say. And so you had all of these elements that made up a very serious band, and they bucked a lot of the trends. The West Coast scene at that time was sort of divided between the hippie scene in San Francisco and the kind of laid back, shall we say, beach hippie scene of LA. The biggest band in LA before the Doors came around was called Love, and they were a band that were very popular in the West Coast in the mid late 60s, but they sort of faded out of obscurity almost as soon as they showed up. They had 3 years or so of a lot of popularity, and then people tended to forget about them. They were a kind of psychedelic but laid back folky rock band, which doesn't really do them justice because they had a lot of progressive elements, very interesting stuff. But it is true that when the Doors came along, they changed everything by creating a sound that was sort of one part horror movie, one part soundtrack to a would-be Charlie Manson horror movie, one part jazz, one part sort of classically inspired because of some of the flourishes on Ray's organ in particular. So they had all of these elements that sounded nothing like the sort of hippie derived music of the West Coast, and nothing like the blues derived music of the Midwest and East Coast, and nothing like the sort of psychedelic blues and proto hard rock of Britain at the time. It was really a sound that was exclusively unique to the Doors themselves. And all of their albums were good. They really didn't have a bad album, and they worked really hard to produce albums very quickly. Let's count them. There was the debut, Strange Days, Waiting for the Sun, Soft Parade, Morrison Hotel, LA Woman. So 6 albums in a relatively short period of time between 67 and 71 when Jim Morrison died. And of course, there were the couple of albums made after Jim as a trio. But when you're iconic because of the original lineup, 3 out of 4 didn't really cut it for audiences, even though those albums themselves aren't bad. But the Doors really ought to be respected as a musical phenomenon more than just a cultural phenomenon. Yes, all of the cultural stuff and the antics and the everything is interesting and it's very photogenic, and that's why Oliver Stone made a largely fictitious film about it. But musically, the legacy is there. You put on a Doors song and it just sounds cool. There's really no two ways about it. On one hand, it sounds very much like it was of its time, but on the other hand, because the Doors themselves were so original in their time, I think that a lot of it really, really holds up well. Because although some bands tried to copy them, that combination of the 4 people was unique, certainly to what came before it. And I would also say it remained unique in terms of what came after it. Light My Fire was, of course, a Robbie Krieger written song. And even though the single cut out one of the most interesting parts, which is, of course, the long organ and guitar solos, I think that the full length album version really encapsulates everything and more that the Doors were about. So, to the many Doors fans out there, congratulations, you've chosen wisely. And to those who have maybe been just sickened by the hype around the band, which can be sickening, listen to them for the music. Forget the hype, forget the stereotypes, forget the mystique. Listen to the music and then come back to me and tell me it's not compelling. I doubt you'll be able to do that. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.